are now in the presence of a king.
Today we're checking out a very interesting new lens from Viltrox. This is the Viltrox 27mm f1.2. It's actually been out for Fujifilm X mount for a little bit now, and people seem to have loved that lens. So Viltrox decided to give it a few upgrades and are releasing it for the Sony E mount. And seriously guys, this might be the best Sony APS-C lens I've ever used. Bold claim, I know, but I mean it. Let's start off with the most important bit, image quality. After shooting with this lens for almost a month, I have to say that the image produced by this lens feels really similar to images produced by Sony G-Master lenses. The sharpness and contrast rendition looks really good, and color grading these images just makes them pop even more. Bokeh rendition on this lens also looks really soft and creamy when wide open, and when closed down, thanks to the 11 aperture blades, you get clean looking bokeh balls. This lens produces sharp centers and edges starting wide open at f1.2. You can tell from regular shots, but it's really obvious once you look at photos of a test chart. Starting at f1.2, centers are really sharp and corners perform exceptionally well. As you stop down, you'll notice that the sharpness mildly improves until you hit about f5.6 to f8, where the lens is at peak sharpness. But really, the entire range from f1.2 all the way up to f11 produces a great image. Something you may notice though, if we zoom out a bit, is vignette performance. It's expected for such a large aperture lens, but you can see that vignetting is present at f1.2 and improves as you stop down, but by f4 the vignetting is completely gone. Now let's take a look at the lens flares produced by this lens. Overall, there's a good amount of flare control in most scenarios, adding just a hint of contrast reduction in a pleasant way. When you get a light source completely side on, like during a sunset, you will see some flaring and ghosting, but if I'm gonna be honest, this is the level of flaring and ghosting that I like to see from my lenses, an amount that's controllable based on the angle you're shooting respective to the light source, but still results in a gorgeous creative looking flare. Another sign of a well-designed lens is going to be how it handles chromatic aberration, and with a lens as wide open as f1.2, a little bit of chromatic aberration is kind of inevitable. The best way I've found to test this and really push it is to film thin, high-contrast objects like branches against the sun. If you look at the out-of-focus areas, you can clearly see that the out-of-focus areas have green and purple fringing. Another way to test this is to shoot something like text in a book and shift your focus around to see how dramatic the chromatic aberration is. As you stop down though, you'll notice that it starts disappearing, with it being completely gone by f4. While chromatic aberration does flare up in this lens in these test scenarios, in real-world shots like this wedding I didn't notice any situations where I saw chromatic aberration in any of the high-contrast scenes. Perspective distortion is another artifact that can introduce unwanted distractions into your shots, and I'm happy to say that the lines rendered by this lens are nearly perfectly straight, with only the slightest amount of barrel distortion. So how about autofocus? How good is it? My biggest concern when it comes to third-party lenses is how well their autofocus hardware works in tandem with Sony's autofocus software. Usually, third-party autofocus systems aren't as smooth as first-party lenses on a Sony body. With a month's worth of testing, in most scenarios, the autofocus works almost as well as a native lens. I'd say about 70 to 80% of the way there. It'll do a great job tracking a subject, but we're not going to get every frame in focus, and you'll see that the focus lags behind the subject ever so slightly when the subject is quickly moving towards or away from the camera. In reality though, this is 100% a perfectly usable shot. Now I will say there was one situation where the autofocus completely failed me. While I was in Louisville, Kentucky for Imaging USA, 𝗖𝗛𝗟𝗥𝗦 and I were out shooting some content, and we ran into the issue of the lens just absolutely refusing to focus at all. I mean, it was definitely a low light environment, it was pretty dark out, but when we switched over to the Sony 50mm f1.4 G-Master, the issue completely disappeared. This was the only time I got this to happen, but I still thought it was important to share. And while we're on the subject of focus, let's talk about focus breathing. This might be one of the bigger deal breakers for you if you're looking at this lens for video work. As you can see, as I focus from the background to the foreground and vice versa, the composition itself changes due to the amount of focus breathing present in this lens. I will say that I've never found this to be a deal breaker for me, and it never bothers me when it ends up in my edits, but it's definitely something I could live without. Now let's take a look at the build quality of the lens. This is something that the Viltrox 27mm f1.2 really shines at. It is a very premium lens, similar to their 16mm f1.8 full-frame lens. Click the card above if you're interested in checking that lens out. But yeah, like I said in that video, Viltrox really seems to be trying to match that G-Master level of quality and features. Holding this lens, you're definitely going to notice that it feels substantial, weighing in at about 560 grams and measuring in at about 82 by 92 millimeters. The lens is basically made entirely out of metal and glass, which really adds to that high quality feel, but it also adds to that heavier weight. As you look around the lens, you'll see that like a G-Master lens, Viltrox included an aperture ring with a click-declick switch for those looking to use this lens for more video-centric work. It has an autofocus manual focus switch, which, by the way, the manual focus on this lens actually feels pretty great to use, and I found it pretty easy to dial in focus. Viltrox even included a custom function button that can be programmed to one of 100 or so available functions, and I personally have it set to toggle on or off eye autofocus. The lens has a 67mm front filter thread diameter, and something that's nice is that it has a minimum focus distance of 11 inches, letting you get some pretty close focus shots. And of course, the lens features weather sealing, which makes it more reliable in various shooting environments. And a nice little bonus in Viltrox lenses is the addition of a USB-C port that's found on the mount of the lens, which lets you install firmware updates. Something that I actually noticed while I was shooting the autofocus test for this video was that the lens motors can actually be kind of loud if you're making the lens rack focus from close to infinity really quickly. Fortunately, I looked online at Viltrox's website and found that they actually had a firmware update to fix this very exact issue, and now that issue is no longer a problem. Viltrox told me that this lens is going to be available in E-mount in March 2024, so it's coming out very soon, and it's going to be priced at about $545. Now, this is usually the point where I talk about alternatives to the lens that I'm talking about, but there really aren't that many good dedicated APS-C lenses out there for the Sony E-mount system that has a wide aperture like f1.2, that has autofocus, that has G-Master like construction and build quality. I think you can really only think of two alternatives to this lens. The first one would be the Sigma 30mm f1.4, which was one of my favorite APS-C lenses in the past. It's definitely cheaper, but it's also very much so a photography-centric lens. And the second one would be the Sirui Sniper series that was recently released, which does include a 23mm f1.2, but again lacks some of the more premium features that the Viltrox lens has. Other than that, you would have to start looking at full-frame lenses for something comparable in quality, like the Sony 24mm f1.4 G-Master. Overall, I think that the Viltrox 27 f1.2 is probably one of the best, if not the best, autofocus APS-C lenses currently available for the Sony E-mount system, and I'm really excited to see what other lenses Viltrox has cooking up. And if you're interested in checking this lens out, there will be links in the description down below. All right, that's it for this one. Let me know in the comment section down below if there's any other lenses that you'd like me to cover for the Sony E-mount system. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like and subscribe, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Peace.